the proceeding. Right now, Dr. Sithembile Mbete, she's here with us, Executive Director, Public Affairs Research Institute, Executive Director. She's here with us just to give us a concluding remarks now and analysis of what has been a 12 months of programs and various meetings, you name it. But really, just wrap it up for us in terms of how successful South Africa has actually done this.
I think South Africa has had a very successful G20. We were the last in the first cycle of G20 meetings to take place, so G20 presidency, Indonesia, then India, then Brazil and South Africa, and really the emphasis of continuing and to consolidate an agenda that was broadly inclusive, that dealt with issues of solidarity, of equality, of sustainability, and that brought a diverse range of voices to the table, which is something that had been a focus for all of the other developing country presidencies, and I think that one that we continued incredibly well in a year that was anticipated and ended up being incredibly difficult for international cooperation and diplomacy and multilateralism. And there were all of these questions about whether South Africa would be able to pull off a successful summit with a declaration, with a leader's declaration, and not some other kind of product that came out of it. And we did manage to do so. And actually the atmosphere, the attitude here at Nasrec was such a positive one, such a joyful one actually at some points, and all the concerns that there were about the United States' absence, that with the US not being here physically, it would still loom large over the proceedings in its absence, and that actually didn't materialize. The meeting continued, and in some ways there was greater freedom of engagement, greater freedom of movement, certainly in the US's absence, than if it had been here. I think that had President Donald Trump himself or Vice President Vance been present at this meeting, the entire meeting would have been about them and not necessarily about the issues that had been discussed over the course of the year. And I think what this allowed for was a real focus on some of the key issues on the declaration. We saw the renewal of the G20 Africa Compact, the establishment or the implementation of the G20 Compact, Africa Compact 2.0, that announcement being made yesterday by the German president, together with our deputy president, Mashatile, and the chair of the AU currently, who all were there to announce this new engagement between Africa and the G20. We saw the establishment of the finance engagement group on Africa, as well as some initiatives being announced around debt sustainability, initiatives being announced around food security, of course the inequality report that was commissioned by South Africa, a first for the G20. And so many people have kept on asking me, well, what's the point if the US next year isn't going to continue with some of the things in the declaration?
Yeah.
I think that what this G20 summit has confirmed is that the G20 is bigger than all the member states. And multilateralism is bigger than any individual country in the world. And you can see an acknowledgement of that in that final paragraph, actually, of the G20 declaration that refers to wanting to work together under the presidency of the United States in 2026, and then saying, and we'll meet again in 2027, and we'll meet in the UK, and in 2028 in Korea. And we support Saudi Arabia's bid to then host the G20 beyond the Republic of Korea. And I think that what that indicates and what that signals is that even if one country in one presidency chooses to have a scaled down agenda, and it seems as though that the United States will host the G20 next year, they want to have a more scaled down agenda to focus on the finance issues, so the original issues of the G20, G20 was formed around, and not to have so much focus on the issues on the Sherpa track, so the development issues and things. But the understanding is that if the US next year decides to have fewer working groups or decides not to have as much focus on the developmental issues, that can be picked up in the next presidency by the UK. It's in the agenda of the G20. The G20 won't stop existing in 2026 because the US says so. The other thing is that the US can't uninvite or demobilize the membership of any country that is a member of the G20. So South Africa will remain a member of the G20 and will remain engaged in all of the issues of the G20 beyond this year and into next year and afterwards. And I think an important point of clarification around the status of the issues that are in the declaration is that, remember, the G20, unlike the United Nations, unlike the World Bank, unlike the IMF, is not a treaty organization. There's no charter that establishes the G20. Also, there's no permanent secretariat, there's no permanent headquarters. The G20 is a club of nations, of significant economies, that meet regularly to coordinate issues around global finance and the global economy, as well as increasingly global politics. But the actual implementation of what comes from the G20 is done at multilateral organization level, so amongst the permanent institutions of multilateralism, so the ILO, the International Labour Organization, the WHO, the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF. That is where what is decided by the G20 or what's proposed by the G20 actually gets implemented. The OECD, the African Union, that is where the implementation of the G20's proposals and initiatives actually happens. And there is nothing that stops that implementation next year beyond this summit. A lot of the implementation of the G20's proposals also happens at national level. So individual countries, individual member states of the G20 saying, actually, this is something that we want to pursue. And I think that, so when we think about what is it that gives life to the proposals that are made by the G20, we must think more broadly than just the G20 being the one that does the implementation, because it's never been that kind of organization or institution or forum.
Yeah. I want us to wrap it up as my last question to say, you have mentioned this organization that will help implement some of these key decisions. Now, we've been talking about transforming those institutions that we have mentioned, some of them financials as well. The thing is, South Africa and other countries in the global south are members of those institutions as well. And we continue talking about this institution must be transformed, right? Are we participating in a meaningful conversation and deliberation that is driving towards the transformation of this institution? Because we have to say, if South Africa is driving that agenda at various multiple platforms, including the United Nations, for example, that South Africa is actually a member. So where are we in terms of actual deliberation on the transformation agenda within those institutions?
Well, this is the big question, right? And I think that there's a lot of that's needed to be faced up to in this G20. That actually, we've been speaking about UN Security Council reform for decades now. We've been speaking about reform of the IMF and World Bank governance mechanisms and voting rights for a very, very long time. And yet we don't see any traction being developed. But I think that the crisis in multilateralism that has come from the United States challenging, the international system, the US that was always the guarantor of multilateral cooperation, the guarantor of the international system, is now actually the spoiler, is now that's actually posing the greatest challenge to that system. And I think that what that's done is that it's precipitated a crisis of governance that is almost creating an urgency around the need to reform that governance, to have a general multilateralism in order to protect the integrity of the system, because people are now waking up to the fact that if you've got a system that relies on the dominance of just one nation or two or three nations, that system is actually really vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I think that those vulnerabilities have been exposed very starkly in this year's G20 presidency, in terms of all the attempts of the US to try to scupper the process, to sabotage, to stop decisions and things from being made. And I think that the reinforcement of multilateralism that has come out of South Africa's G20 Leadership Summit is a really important symbolic and practical thing and initiative, and that in the future, I think we're going to see an acceleration of a lot of the reform efforts, because if we don't do that, then the vulnerabilities that we see within the multilateral system are only going to get worse.
Well, we'll keep on looking at this, and South Africa will definitely not stop pursuing that agenda as well. Let me thank you so much for your time to give us these concluding remarks for us. In a few seconds, what has this done as us actually delivering this important summit for President Ramaphosa?
I think it's bolstered his position. I heard a diplomat earlier today describe him as a master tactician. I think any leader would have found it difficult to host the G20 under these circumstances. And I think South Africa did it masterfully. We did it really, really well, and we can all be proud of ourselves as a nation.
Dr. Sithembile Mbete, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right.
This is Ubuntu Radio.
A better South Africa, a better Africa, and a better world.